Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Hardly Heroic, a channel where I, Emilio, mostly talk about fictional weapons on the tabletop. But today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Mr. Duncan Hill, to talk about actual weapons in real life, specifically crossbows.
Hi, everybody. Emilio, thank you very much for having me on the channel. I'm always very happy to talk crossbows.
Yes, Mr. Hill, or Duncan, as I will refer to him, calls himself by a very peculiar name. Would you please share that with the audience?
Sure, yeah, it's the name of my business. It's Modern Arm Brewster, and so the second word, arm brewster, is actually a German word, which essentially it can mean somebody who makes crossbows or somebody who uses crossbows. And I don't think it's a word that one hears very much anymore these days. But I decided to use that for my business because I'm in the business of making reproductions of historical crossbows.
I will, of course, include a link to Duncan's actual shop, and you can see some of the very lovely things that he's made. But it is interesting, of course, that you chose to call yourself the modern armbruster. Firstly, that's not a word that I've ever actually heard. I've been involved in historical martial arts and tabletop gaming and all this kind of stuff for years and years and years. But when I found your shop, that was the first time I ever found somebody who had a word to describe what a crossbow maker was. And I just thought that was very interesting. Why exactly do you call yourself the modern Armbruster?
That's a great question. Well, so first of all, I did choose the German word for crossbow maker because Germany has always had a very strong tradition in making and shooting and using crossbows. And many of the surviving historical crossbows that exist today are German. Of course, there's lots of Flemish crossbows and Spanish as well, and Italian crossbows too. But I had a particular affinity, let's say, for German crossbows. And the reason why I put the word modern in there is because really, in order to make it a viable, business enterprise, I had to make some concessions, and so that would include, for example, like I don't typically use bone and horn, for example, in with the materials that I use to make my crossbows. And I use some modern materials as well, like plastic and modern crossbow prods. The prod is the bow, the bendy bit at the front. And I mean, that just makes it a lot more economically viable to do. So that's why I tend to call them reproductions or even, historically styled crossbows rather than truly authentic replicas, which they are not.
It's interesting that you say that because I'm only really aware of one other person who sort of makes crossbows sort of as a business, and that's Todd from Todd's workshop, right? And those crossbows are, as far as I can tell, made quote unquote authentically, as in they have forged steel prods, but they're very expensive. They're extremely expensive. Not to mention converting into the pound, which tends to be a very strong currency. I
Mhm.
have noticed, of course, that Todd's workshop. I don't deny that the pieces are very well made and certainly, I think, lethal, right? But I do think that there is a difference, I think, in approach where your shop uses, like you said, you use modern aluminium prods. You don't use bone, which is a contentious and perhaps sometimes very fiddly material to work with. What exactly was the genesis of all of this? How exactly does somebody become a crossbow maker? I assume you didn't go to university to study this.
No, I didn't, and it's actually, this is a beautiful segue that you mentioned Todd's workshop, because that's actually how I came into this. Just one day, randomly in my YouTube feed, Todd's workshop video came up, and it's his complete making process of a Dark Ages crossbow. So if anybody out there is interested in looking at that, just type that into the YouTube search, and you'll come across that video. And so I watched this video. I have a background in woodworking. I've always enjoyed woodworking, making furniture and things like that as a hobby. And so in watching this video, I as I was watching, I realized, hey, wait a minute, I can do that. And crossbows just seem inherently cool to me, frankly. I mean, this is very much the little boy kind of aspect of me, I suppose. But crossbows just seem cool, so I decided, well, I'll take a crack and make that. And so I did, and it worked. And one thing that I particularly liked about this video, and then of course learning more about what Todd does, is it's all based on historical research, right? So this particular crossbow in that video, the Dark Ages crossbow, it's known as the Coletier Charavine crossbow, and it's based on on an archaeological find from Charavine in France, and it's typically understood to have been a hunting crossbow. So this is probably not something that was used in war. Nevertheless, it's just very interesting to recreate something based on actual historical evidence.
I think if
I found that. Yep,
I think if I recall correctly, that crossbow is all wood,
that's correct. Yes,
which
yeah,
is
exactly. So
very
the
unusual, I think.
it's actually not so unusual. It's unusual in that there are not a lot of all wood crossbows that survive from the medieval period. That is one of them. I think there's probably less than a dozen. I would imagine that there's not many anyway. And my assumption is that this is because they've all sort of rotted away. But the evidence that we have is that the earlier or earliest European crossbows had prods. Again, the bow at the front. The prods were made. They were self prods, which basically means it's made out of one continuous piece of wood that's then carved down, similar to the way a longbow is made, or so yeah, I think all wood crossbows were not that unusual, and I think it was probably the state of the art at a certain point. But with the Crusades, my understanding is that the Crusaders learned about composite bow technology from the Islamic world, using horn and sinew to make more powerful prods, and that was brought back again to Europe, and we see that kind of taking things over once you get into the 13th and 14th centuries.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because I think and we'll get into this later, but I think the popular perception of crossbows has sort of maybe calcified around the idea that a crossbow kind of looks a little bit like a gun, but it has a steel prod. And you never even see the like spanning devices for crossbows. It
Hmm.
almost seems like every time in a movie or a game, somebody can just span a bow that is meant to be a war bow or something like that, something that can kill people, but they can span it by hand. Um, it's a
Yeah.
it's very funny because speaking of Todd's workshop, I think one of my favorite videos of his ever is about all the different ways of spanning a crossbow.
Yes.
Um, I think for me, I've when I was a kid, I tried to make a crossbow, and I didn't have access to woodworking technology. I had access to Lego, so
Hmm.
you could imagine that young me trying to fabricate a crossbow out of Lego, I would have never made something that was, approximating a real crossbow because obviously Lego is plastic and
Hmm.
the parts are not meant for making crossbows. But I was able to make something that could fire tiny little nails. And I
Nice.
think I remember my parents telling me that I had to dismantle it because they didn't want me, going around just shooting things.
Right.
um, but I think there is this childhood fixation, maybe that some people have. Some people they watch like Lord of the Rings and they see Legolas and he's got that bow and they think, wow, that's cool. For
Hmm.
me, I was always fascinated with crossbows from a very young age. I think it's because they are partially mechanical and
Hmm.
they're not like they change so much, right? Bows, if you look at the history of the bow, once you can develop initial early bows and then you go to composite bows and then eventually you're producing things like longbows, the bow technology doesn't really change until you get to modern archery, where now you can add things like stabilizers and risers and all of those things, and then it doesn't really look like a bow anymore. But in
Right.
the time period of crossbows lifespan, and you could speak more about this, but they change. They like the Dark Age bow looks kind of like a crossbow, but it doesn't look like a 14th century crossbow and doesn't look certainly anything like a 16th century crossbow.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, and it's yeah, the crossbow itself, it's a fascinating object, and I think partly precisely because of what you mentioned, that it's a mechanism, right? It's not just a stick with a string on it, which, with all due respect to bows, I mean that's kind of an amazingly elegant solution to a ranged weapon right there, is a stick with a string, right? But yeah, I mean, with crossbows, the fact that there's a mechanism involved, that's certainly one of the things that drew me into it. Right? Is well, what kind of mechanism are you going to use, and how do you design that to make it as sort of physically optimal as possible? Um, and so on. And it's yeah. I think as well, part of the fascination for me, and again, getting back to that sort of childlike, I guess, piece of it is just this idea of like, I mean, how many times have any one of us like balled up a piece of paper to throw it in the garbage, and then you try to throw it in, right? It's this idea of like throwing something and to try to get it into the basket or into the hoop or whatever. And I feel like this is part of that. I speculate. I mean, it's completely unqualified, but I speculate there's some kind of inherent mm, desirability to that, right? Of throwing a thing to hit the other thing, and so I feel like that might be a big piece of what makes any kind of missile weapon just inherently interesting.
No, I mean you can see this, right? Like if you study ancient history, you can see that in ancient societies, lots of people would know how to use a sling, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and the sling is a very simple thing. In fact, pretty much most people, even today, can make one just from a piece of scrap leather and some cord. Uh, but there is something about just having something that you can throw, and a crossbow is a much more sophisticated version of that. But
Mm.
they're not. They're not too. It's not like a firearm, right? Where everything is done with a chemical reaction. It's still muscle
Right.
power, but it's a much more thoughtful, maybe transformation about muscle power.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think when it comes to exposure, you do see crossbows in lots of media. They kind of are, even though many of them are contemporaneous to bows. And in fact, I think they outlast bows in sort of usage. A
Mhm.
lot of crossbows are just depicted as another kind of thing. That in a video game or whatever, you have an archer and he can shoot fast with his bow, and you have a crossbow and it maybe shoots a more powerful attack, but you can do it less often.
Yeah.
I I have to wonder because I think that we have these crossbow depictions in media, but they're not really very good in my opinion. I've only
Mhm.
done a little bit of reading on the matter. It's just it's like, oh, you find out a thing and then you realize, oh no, everything's actually kind of wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm actually very interested in that topic of sort of the kind of modern reception of historical objects in general. But I mean, crossbows are a great example. So as you mentioned, you see crossbows in popular media. So the most recent thing that I can think of that I saw crossbows in was I'm not sure if you're familiar with the television series of Vikings.
Yes,
And
yeah, I know if I can.
yeah, yeah. So there's a whole sequence where Ragnar and his merry band of Vikings decide to lay siege to Paris. And so the Parisians are all armed with these crossbows, and you can see them on the battlements, and they all appear to have sort of wooden prods, and they're all spanning them with their hands, and then shooting these really heavy bolts and skewering and killing the Vikings. And as you mentioned just now, the idea of hand spanning a crossbow and being able to just kill somebody with it is I mean, theoretically it's possible, certainly, if you have fairly high weight, I don't know, 150, 200 pounds or something like that. But when we're watching this battle unfold, clearly like these are fairly lightweight crossbows. um yeah, it's kind of interesting. I, I'm of two minds about it because, of course, when you're watching a film or television, you don't want to get bogged down in like, oh, how accurate is this? And that prod is 2 inches longer than it should have been at that time, and et cetera and so forth. So it kind of detracts from your enjoyment of the thing, and maybe it's enough that we think of the depiction of the crossbow on the screen as a kind of iconography, right? So
Mhm.
these crossbows that the actors are using, that's in a sense a symbol. Hey, it's a crossbow. They're defending their castle with crossbows, and maybe that's enough, and it doesn't necessarily need to be slavishly accurate to history. But on the other hand, talking about other folks who make crossbows, and I think you're right. Like, I mean, there's very few people, and certainly very few that have them commercially available. As you mentioned, there's Todd in England, who's very very high end. There's somebody actually in the United States in Texas. The business is called Swifthound Bows, and she makes absolutely beautiful crossbows. They're a little more kind of like what I do, where it's sort of historically inspired rather than being very very historically accurate. Um, but um, but a lot of sort of, let's call them amateurs, and this isn't a sort of pejorative term, but people who don't make them to sell money to sell them for money. I see a lot of folks making crossbows, for example, where the front end of the crossbow will be very wide, and then it narrows before the lock, and then widens again. Well, that is a modern reception or perception of the way a medieval crossbow would look. However, all of the research that I've done, I have never once come across a crossbow that narrows and then widens again at the front in that way. But it appears that way because of the way that the prod is bound on with binding. It looks like the stock gets wider there, but in fact it doesn't. So anyway, this is a very nitty gritty example of
No,
the sort of,
it's in,
yeah.
it's interesting that you mentioned all of this because I think firstly, the general public, because I do HEMA, right, and I can be very
Mm.
annoying about sword fighting whenever I'm watching movies. I think I've learned to be a little bit more. Oh, it's it's a movie. Let's just have fun, right? Um, but sometimes I see things about swords that like cutting through armor that always annoys me because it's such an obvious thing because I know in real life that I can't cut through a car door with a sword.
Right.
No matter how strong I
Yeah.
am, I won't be able to cut through it physically. So I think, okay,
Yeah.
well, that changes my perception of the scene, but that's neither here nor there. But I think
Mhm.
one of the issues with crossbows is that modern people are so far removed from using crossbows, right? Modern people don't know how to, they don't use crossbows in their day to day. So I think
Mhm.
they kind of default to a crossbow is kind of like a gun, but it fires a bolt instead of a bullet. And a
Mhm.
lot of information about crossbows is hard to come by. As I was doing research, because we'll talk about this, you are actually building a crossbow for me. Um,
Yes.
and as I was doing research for it, I really struggled because a lot of the books about crossbows are either very expensive or out of print or both. And
Mhm.
that makes it hard for people, I think, to really get a sense of like what they're about. Because I look at your website and I see crossbows that are truly like works of art, in my opinion, but they don't
Thank
look
you,
like
thank you.
what I was expecting. But they don't
Yeah.
look like what I was expecting. In fact, they have features that when I do more reading, I see, oh, yeah, they did actually have sights. Oh, they did actually have shaped stocks and stuff
Right.
like that. And like, I want to get some sense from you about like, how do you do your research? Like, what do you do in order to research for your crossbows, like your crossbow making?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a great question, and I mean that actually leads directly on from my, or let's call it, origin story about finding this video on Todd's workshop, and making that. That sort of showed me the link between making, right, like actually creating something with your hands, and historical research. So my undergraduate degree was actually in art history, which is somewhat related actually, because it's, again, like this, art history is something where you are researching the history of people making shit, right, basically. And so in this case, so once I finished that crossbow, the Cheravine crossbow, I just went down the rabbit hole, and I just wanted to find out more and more about crossbows. And the more I looked at crossbows, and the more I read about them, I had a very similar reaction to you, which is like, oh, this is not really what I was expecting. I mean, I don't know if I had any specific expectations of what I would find out about medieval and early modern crossbows, but whatever I did find wasn't it. And so, really, it was. I'm very also fortunate that I work at a university, so I have access to the university library, and so, doing research in that way, like looking at the library catalog and finding books that way, and finding journal articles and things like that. Yeah, so it's a lot of reading, and it's a lot of translation too. So I don't actually speak German. I've picked up a fair amount of crossbow terminology in German, but I do a lot of machine translation, because a lot of the published work out there about historical crossbows is actually published in German.
Oh, that would make a lot of sense. I think
Mhm.
on YouTube, one of the guys that I think of as like a big crossbow guy is Jörg Sprav, and he's a German man. So I imagine
Right.
that a lot of there's some kind of cultural lingering, shall we say, in the same way
Mhm.
of like when I think of English people, I associate them with archery, even though I think the average British person doesn't really do anything with archery anymore. I think of like, oh, German
Mhm.
people crossbows. Although video games sometimes I think portrayed as like Italians are the crossbow people, and maybe we
Mhm.
can talk about that. But I also work at a university, so you and I are kindred spirits. I started learning how to speak Spanish because the guy who makes my swords is Spanish. So
Oh, okay, right on. Excellent.
yeah, but his English is now much better than my Spanish. So it's one of those funny things. But I mean, it is,
Yeah.
I think you mentioned art history, right? Like a lot of these
Mhm.
crossbows are in museums and they are exhibited because I've been to some. I've been to some in Europe, and you see them exhibited, and it is kind of like a work of art.
Mhm.
It's a beautiful object in a way a firearm today isn't, right? Like a modern
Yes.
firearm built for even a wealthier person is still much more utilitarian than a lot of hunting crossbows, which might have been made for like middle class people, end
Mhm.
up looking. I think that's like
Yeah.
fascinating because it says something about medieval society that is also lost in modern translation. That like yeah, they can have an object that is both beautiful and functional,
Mhm.
whereas we are much more dichotomous, where something is either functional or it's pretty, and it can't really be both.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. And it raises lots of other questions. So one of the things that jumps to mind um, when I think about that, and specifically the physical design of objects, and of course, like the design is going to follow function, right? To a certain extent, but like if we think about crossbows, right? So as you mentioned, yes, like, and that's part of what drew me to this as well, is that these things not only are the interesting mechanisms, but the way that they were decorated, particularly the higher status ones, are just, I mean, it's jaw-droppingly beautiful, at least to me. Um, but then, yeah, like when you think about the way that modern crossbows are designed, they do appear very, very utilitarian. But I do think there's more to it than that, and that is the vast majority of modern crossbows that I've seen. I've looked at modern crossbow websites a bit too, so this isn't just my impression. Like this is from looking at modern crossbows. They all seem to be designed to look like assault rifles, and I think this is a very it is funny, but
Yeah.
I think it's a very specific reason, and I think it actually is linked. And this is I'm shooting from the hip here, so this is fairly unqualified. I have not researched this at all, but when I think about the way that early modern crossbows, for example, were designed and decorated, there's all sorts of reasons why they were designed and decorated in that particular way. One of the things, and this is we'll get into the weeds a little bit here. So if I'm going on too long, feel free to just jump in and tell me to pipe down. But so early modern German crossbows. So once we get into the 16th century, there's a particular type of crossbow that is now known as a Halbe Rüstung. Rüstung literally means just weapon or armor, and Halbe means half. There was like Halbe Rüstung, which it means half weapon. There's Gans Rüstung, and then there's Viertel Rüstung. And so Viertel means quarter, Gans means full, and Halbe means half. And this had to do with the power of the prod. The stock of these crossbows was all they were all typically designed in pretty much the same way, variations in decoration. One of the details of the design is the trigger guard, and the trigger guard on these particular types of crossbows, it looks like an L-shaped piece of metal essentially, and it looks very, very much like, almost exactly like, a medieval crossbow trigger lever itself. And so to me, this is iconography where the crossbow makers in the 16th century have decided to keep this design element, even though it no longer really had a function for what it originally was. It's no longer a lever; it's simply a trigger guard. So, in a similar way, when I think about modern crossbows and how they're designed to kind of look like assault weapons, I feel like that there's mm, a similar mechanism happening there where the designer of the crossbow wants to evoke, right? They want to evoke something, and in this case, in modern crossbows, they want to evoke this idea of like practical. Oh, it's like in special forces of like dressing up and playing soldier. Whereas, in the 16th century in Germany, perhaps they wanted to evoke a certain reception of medievality in the design of the crossbows as they moved forward in time. And in fact, that trigger guard design persisted right up until certainly into the 18th century.
Yeah, that's fascinating because I think you're onto something there. I never really thought about modern crossbows as quote unquote looking like assault rifles, but I think on the one hand, a lot of these modern crossbows are built with injection molded plastic,
Hmm.
and their bolts sometimes they have compound systems. I'm not a huge fan of compound systems in general. I think they rob the item of its essence. I know they're much more
Mm.
efficient, but I'm not buying a crossbow or using a bow or something because I want to be efficient, right?
Hmm.
Um, I want to sort of reconnect with the essence of the object. And I mean, obviously, you can see these objects as being partially mass produced, right? Because you
Hmm.
can buy the cost difference between like I think it's like I think you can buy a crossbow on Amazon depending on where you are for like under $100,
Hmm.
and that's it's not going to be a great crossbow. In fact, I think I might have some questions about firing some of those things, but
Hmm.
that's not very like it's cheap enough that somebody who's just an amateur, maybe during a bit of a drunken spending spree could buy one and then think, oh yeah, I didn't waste a bunch of money on a crossbow. But then you look at what it takes to make a real crossbow, and then the cost is vastly enormous. So I think it's also the reason why these guns, why these crossbows end up looking a lot like guns, is also because they're mass produced in a sense.
Hmm.
Whereas if you have a craftsman approach to making it, then on the one hand, craftsmen take much more pride in what they're working on because they're producing something specifically, that is a product of their own hands. But also they are more limited, right? You don't
Hmm.
have access to a factory somewhere that can produce 10,000 crossbow prods,
Hmm.
or 10,000 stocks, or you have to shape the stocks by hand, right?
Yep. Yeah, yeah,
And
exactly. Yep.
it's interesting because there is this evolution in the medieval to Renaissance to early modern period, as you said. The crossbows are obviously undergoing some evolution. Maybe you can talk about that as well, because
Mhm.
but there is still an attempt. There is still an attempt to keep the essence of the thing intact. Even though an 18th century crossbow is very different from a 15th century crossbow, it's still recognizable as a crossbow,
Mhm.
whereas a thing with lots of like holes cut into it and a thumb hole stock and this thing and that thing and a laser sight, that's starting to drift quite a bit more, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think I know what you're getting at when you talk about the essence of the object, but I also think that idea is probably a fairly subjective one too.
Hmm.
I mean, so like going back to the example that I was talking about before with the Vikings television show, and these Parisian troops on the battlements shooting their crossbows. There, I think the producers of the show are giving them crossbows because at this a quick visual glance you can see, oh, that's a crossbow, right? So there's something essential about that appearance where you've basically got one stick and another stick and it looks like a T shape and it's like, oh, okay, that's a crossbow. But yeah, I mean, I think like in terms of the evolution of design and sort of where it has come to now versus how the design of crossbows was evolving, in the early modern period, from the medieval to the early modern period. Um, you referred to sort of things, for example, a compound system is designed for efficiency. Well, that's a huge part of how um, historical crossbows developed. It was all about efficiency, and that completely governed the direction, um, in formal terms as well as functional terms, of the
Hmm.
evolution of crossbows. So when we see, for example, the lock mechanisms on some of these, and I'm going to keep talking about German crossbows because those are the ones that I think I know most about. Um, but when we look at, yeah, the evolution of lock mechanisms, that was all about efficiency. So they went from these single axle lock mechanisms where you had that lever, that trigger lever I was talking about earlier, right up until the end of the 15th century. This sort of single, and actually it went beyond there too, because the Spanish kept that mechanism on going quite a bit longer than in Germany. But yeah, I mean, this is a very, very simple mechanism. But as prods, and particularly steel prods, got stronger and stronger, they decided, oh, let's make two axles, right? So then you get even more mechanical advantage because you've got a sort of like intermediate tumbler that's involved there. And then they moved on to four axles. And again, they're looking for more and more efficiency. So you need less and less strength to pull the trigger. And if you're using less strength to pull the trigger, you can actually be steadier with your aim. So really, that evolution actually was all about efficiency. So I mean, thinking about the essence of the object. I mean, for me, the essence of a crossbow really is it's this idea of having a bow that you stick on a stick that has a lock
Mhm.
mechanism, and that's basically it. And from there, it's as long as that's it. That's a crossbow. But
It
yeah,
is
it's an
interesting.
interesting. Yeah.
No, it is for sure, right? Again, I'm also shooting from the hip here. I
Mhm.
think what sort of sticks in my mind is as you look at the lifespan of crossbows, I think the historical apex for crossbows is round about the 15th century. Um, after the 15th century, as you're getting into the 16th century, increasingly crossbows can't compete with firearms. But despite that fact, crossbows still continue to exist. We still see that they're being made, in relatively large numbers, and they're still, if anything, I think they kind of become higher status items,
Mhm.
because a lot of the surviving examples are, hunting pieces that were owned, not necessarily war pieces. Um,
Mhm.
why do you think crossbows managed to persist for so long, even though bows didn't? It's like you don't see as many examples of like, oh, this is a hunting, a bow, as opposed to like a hunting crossbow, and one is enormously decorated and like a work of art, and then something like that sort of fell out.
Mhm, mhm. I mean, I can't really speak to just but hand bows very much, but yeah, in terms of crossbows, I think you're right. So I mean, and you're absolutely right that once you get beyond the 15th century, they were just completely supplanted in military context by firearms for sure. There's a very notable exception, which has obvious dark connotations, which is the Spanish military using them in the conquest of Mexico and other
Right.
parts of North America. So they did continue using crossbows in that context, but even there, eventually they got phased out too.
I think the first time I ever saw a crossbow was actually a conquistador using a crossbow. It was in a
Okay, yeah, yeah.
book on world history. So no, you're totally right there, right?
Mm. Yeah, and it's but it's you ask a really really good question, which is, well, why then did crossbows persist? So I think I've heard discussions that, well, they're really good for hunting because they're not as noisy. I mean, and by the way, crossbows are in no way silent. I think that's another one of these popular misconceptions about crossbows. They are not silent. But yeah, but they're certainly a hell of a lot quieter than firearms. So when you're hunting and you're shooting at game, you're less likely to startle every other animal within a 10-mile radius if you're using a crossbow. But I don't think that's the entirety of the story there, because of course they were used extensively with target shooting as essentially as organized sport, right? Even from the medieval period, when they were still used in a military context, you'd have these crossbow guilds set up, which were essentially
A
kind of like a
shooting club.
militia, right? Yeah, yeah, but it was a way to keep people trained up, so they can defend the city as needed, and so they would have like these competitions between cities, and that tradition has persisted. I mean, in Italy, for example, there's a league where cities
Ooh,
compete against each other, and yeah, in with crossbow shooting, and the types of crossbows they use, they're what I would call medieval-ish. So they're as I understand it, they kind of originated in the 19th century as a kind of like it, kind of like a 19th century understanding or reception of sort of the ideal medieval, you know, crossbow, right? So it doesn't really have much of a root in like a direct line, let's say, to medieval crossbows, but it's sort of the impression of people in the 19th century. But nevertheless, The mechanics of them, they're single axle crossbows. They have a rolling nut. They use franniquins to span them. They
Hmm.
have steel prods and beautifully, in some cases, beautifully ornate wooden stocks as well. And yeah, and they have these shooting clubs and this league where cities compete with each other. And so these traditions absolutely continue. And Belgium is another great example where there's crossbow guilds there, and they do something called
That's
shooting
very
the
cool.
popinjay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there's one of the oldest ones, I think, is in Brussels. I think it's like the Guild of St. George, I think.
Oh,
And I
because of the
think they
dragon
were
slaying, I guess.
maybe, yeah. It's sort of their, I guess, perhaps their patron saint or something. But I believe that guild originated in like the 14th century or something like that. So it's these
Wow,
traditions still persist, and yeah, I mean,
that's
I
crazy.
think yeah, it is, and I think maybe the reason why. So this is a very long-winded answer to your question. Um, I think it has persisted maybe because of what we were talking about at the beginning of this discussion. This idea of just this inherently satisfying action of I want to try to hit that thing with this thing, like that
Hmm.
and and the other piece of it too, which I think is quite technical, which actually I think is the reason why crossbows were invented to begin with, is it requires a lot less training to become proficient at shooting a crossbow than it does a hand bow.
Yeah,
And
you have to, in order to build the muscles required to span a bow, that's a lifetime of training,
oh,
right?
100%.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
y- and you don't need to do that to fire a crossbow. It's kind of the thing that also drew me to them because my school also had an archery club, and I was never the strongest, kid. And
Mhm.
I just kept thinking to myself, I can't really persist in this because I can't physically pull back these things. Um,
Right.
and the thought always came to me, but if I had a crossbow, then I could also shoot, with these guys because I don't need to be that strong. The machine basically will sort of figure that out for me,
Mhm.
and it's interesting because obviously, I think of crossbows as in a weird way. I think it's like the bow and arrow is much more the specialized weapon. It's much like if you want to be a soldier and the bow is your primary weapon, you are like a high level guy, right? To actually shoot with accuracy and power and all that stuff. But as you said, a militia, you can kind of give a crossbow to somebody who has never used one before, and they'll not be too bad at it after like an afternoon of practice.
That's
Um,
right. That's right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I know.
and
I
yeah,
think yeah, that's exactly right. And it's interesting because as you were talking, it's the word accessibility came to my mind, and obviously that has very specific connotations. In our time now, but I mean, the idea of it being an accessible sport because it's not as demanding as shooting a handbow, right? Even if you are shooting a lightweight handbow, to become proficient enough to be accurate with your shots, even if it's a lightweight bow, is still, it takes a while. Whereas with a crossbow, it certainly is a lot easier to get there, right? To shoot accurately. So yeah, I think that definitely is a big part of it.
yeah, it's one of those things where I think in order to really understand the differences, you actually have to use the items, which I think is a great segue to talking about, of course, the reason why we actually met, which is that I wanted you to make a crossbow for me.
Yes.
Um, so you have a huge spectrum. As far as I understand it, your business is basically you get people like me send you an email and say, "Hey, listen, I want you to build me a crossbow," and then you basically go and do that. I Why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about the process of actually doing this, and maybe you can also tell them a bit about the crossbow that you're making for me.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, it's exactly exactly you've described. I'll get an email from somebody saying, "Hey, I want a crossbow." Um, so the very first thing that I do, so usually people don't have a very specific idea in mind. Occasionally they do. So a big part of my clientele comes from the Society for Creative Anachronism (SCA),
SDA.
which you might
Yep.
be, yeah, yeah, and yeah, and these are essentially quasi historical reenactors, and Yeah, so a lot of my clients come from that. And so folks from there typically have a fairly specific idea of what they want to do. Sometimes they want something which is just not it literally is anachronistic. Like this is not a historical crossbow. So occasionally I'll kind of decline just because it's not really what I want to spend my time doing. That doesn't happen very much, but once in a while. But in most cases, people know they want something medieval-ish or early modern-ish, but they don't really know. So a big part of my process is sort of asking the customer to say, "Hey, why don't you send me some photographs of crossbows that you really dig, that you really like, and are sort of what you're kind of thinking about." And so from there, I work up a 3D model using SketchUp, um, and so I present that this is what I can. And then if there's any tweaks to be made, and then we kind of agree on that. And from that, based on that, and based on the materials that we've discussed and the customer has chosen, then I'll work up the final quote, and we kind of go from there. So yeah, I mean, in your case, you're looking for something that's sort of more of what we would call these days a munition boat, right? So something that's less high status, less decorated, and more utilitarian. And and also, you were looking for something where it'd be easy to switch out the prod, so you can move between a lower poundage prod and a higher poundage prod. So for something like that, it definitely requires bow irons, which is a way of fixing the prod onto the stock using instead of a cord to essentially tying it on with a cord, which is a somewhat elaborate arrangement. It uses metal brackets, which are very easily taken off and put back on again. And so typically, bow irons were used mostly in Western European crossbows. So the design that we settled on was sort of certainly a Western European crossbow design, vaguely Spanish. And
uh,
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I think I probably come to you with a bit of an unusual requirement, which is that I need a bow that can kind of do two things that are very different. I
Hmm.
mentioned before that I do HEMA. I'm trying to get into maybe a bit more of the world of historical reenactment, which is
Yep.
uh, similar, of course, to SEA, but without the fighting rules that they've got and all of those things. Because the SEA community is not very big in this country. Um,
Hmm.
but I want to do a historical reenactment. I mentioned in the before we were talking that I recently acquired a flintlock pistol that
Mm.
shoots rubber bands. And when I'm doing HEMA classes, I want to be able to tell my students, okay, well, if you have a gun and a sword, which are very popular combinations in historical fencing, right? You watch any pirate movie, and every pirate has like a billion pistols and a sword. This is how you have to, this is how you have to use them, right? You have to have the gun here and the sword here, and you do all these. I've always been a huge fan of crossbows, and I just think, well, historical sources when your crossbowmen and your knights or your men at arms or whatever are fighting in close concert together, and I wanted something where I could shoot like a padded a bolt at my
Mhm.
in my classes and not have to worry about killing somebody. But then also I kind of want to do target shooting and sort of like live my childhood dreams of having a thing that I can do for
Mhm.
target shooting. So I needed something like that. And yeah, I do like a more utilitarian look. You do make some really nice stuff, but it's also a question of budget, right? So
Mhm. Of
it's
course.
one of
Yeah.
those things where you have to optimize a bunch of different variables, and it is one of those things where I thought, yeah, I think bow irons are something I was only kind of aware of because I'd seen them in depictions, but I never really understood, what they were for, right?
Mhm.
It's why I wanted to talk to you because, yeah, in retrospect, it seems like, oh, bow irons are a great idea because they solve that particular problem of how to interchange the prod. But
Right.
when you don't actually often see them, it's interesting because crossbows have all these kinds of paraphernalia associated with them, like goat's foot levers, cranachins. On your crossbows, you do a spanning lever. You do the one where you span it instead of the goat's foot lever, which you push back. You do the one where you push forward. I think on the
Yeah.
Schneeper type crossbows.
That exactly. Yeah. So it's as I understand it, it's a German German development. It's in German. It's called a Wippe. I've also seen the term gaffle or gaff lever, and yeah, I mean it operates in some respects. It's the same principle of a goat's foot lever or something else, which is like just essentially getting mechanical advantage to span a crossbow that you couldn't necessarily with your own arm strength. But in this case, yeah, the lever itself is anchored at the front of the crossbow, and then the fork pushes against the string and pushes it back to the lock, whereas the goat's lever is anchored behind the lock, and the lever actually pulls the crossbow to the lock. But of course, the end result is the same.
It's interesting, of course. Maybe you could give the viewers just a brief sort of summary, because the basic idea with crossbows is that in the beginning, they were hand spanned because the bows were relatively light and a physical person could pull back on that string and, prepare the crossbow. But then as they got
Mhm.
more powerful, we needed to be more creative with how to pull them because it physically is not possible for somebody to pull that kind of weight by themselves.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it's yeah, it all starts with actually a physics formula, which is essentially measuring or used to measure linear torque, and we typically use the units foot pounds for that, or inch pounds as well, and so I'm going to try to see if I can summarize this without being too long-winded. But essentially, the if you think of a hand bow, just a bow and arrow, the distance between the string at rest and at full draw, where it's sort of like the string is up near your ear, that distance is typically called the power stroke. And so if you multiply that power stroke by the amount of weight that you have to hold at full draw, and then divide by two, you get the linear torque, the inch pounds. So, and it works exactly the same way with a crossbow, the string at rest versus the string at full draw, and so on. Um, so, as you can probably imagine with and certainly with European crossbows, this is the case. Chinese crossbows are a whole different thing, which I don't know a lot about, and there's
Oh
big
yeah, for
questions
sure.
about.
They're like in a lot of ways, a lot of the Chinese martial systems are very unusual, interesting, but also very different to a lot of the things that are, in the West.
Yeah, yeah. There's big questions as to why crossbows evolved the way they did in China, and they actually predate European crossbows, and why crossbows evolved in a fairly different way. So, but all that to say, in Europe, what you have are fairly short prods, so they're probably half or less than half of the length of, for example, an English longbow. But that means the stronger that the prod is, the shorter of a power stroke you can have. But when you have a shorter power stroke, you're getting less power into the projectile. So they need to increase the strength of the prod. So it becomes this kind of like circular arrangement where you're trying to optimize how powerful the prod is, and get the most power stroke that you can. With a lot of medieval and early modern crossbows, the power strokes were remarkably short. We're talking like 5, 6, 7 inches, something like that. So you really needed a lot of power in there to make it an effective weapon for shooting, whether you're shooting deer or shooting people.
Yeah, one of
But
the
anyways,
oh, sorry.
yep.
No, I was
No,
just
I
going
was
to
just
say
going
that
to
one
say
of
that.
the sorry.
You go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to say that like one of the big surprising things for people, especially laymen, is that they'll hear a crossbow has like 1,000 pound draw weight, and then if you span and shoot that, it doesn't like instantly obliterate something when it hits, and that's because the power
Yeah,
stroke. It's because you have 1,000 pounds, yes, but you're shooting it from a 5 inch span.
that's right.
You don't have that much time for the bolt to even accelerate before it is off the crossbow and is going to start to lose energy. And
Exactly.
yeah, it, yeah, you can improve that by having a stronger crossbow, but then you run into limits, and you might not be able to physically pull something like that, and then you have to invent a device. And I'm not sure about you, but I'm really fascinated by cranaquins.
Hmm.
I think
Yeah,
no, go ahead.
yeah. I was just going to say that certainly it's been on my to do list for about 2 years, and I made a design for a Quinn. And I just haven't got around to building it. I mean, it's all they're all made completely out of metal, and I'm not a particularly adept metal worker, and I don't really have the
Hmm.
tools for it. But excuse me, I designed mine. My design is based on the assumption of having the parts laser cut out of plate
Mhm.
steel. So I just haven't got around to actually doing that yet. But yeah, they're fascinating devices, and much like they're the crossbows that they go with. They range from very utilitarian things all the way up to like very lavishly decorated devices as well. And it's interesting to me that really it was Panaquins that became these high status objects, and the other spinning mechanisms that we've talked about, like goat foot levers and vipes and even windlasses, they don't seem to have really attained the level of investment in decoration as Cranachins did.
Personally, I think a windlass is a fiddly device. I've seen
Yes.
them,
Yeah.
I've seen them used. I know Todd makes windlass crossbows, which are ginormous things, right? They are
Hmm.
truly massive beasts. But I could just picture myself fiddling with a windlass, it all getting, like the wind blows or something. I drop, like, it just,
Yeah.
it fills me
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
kind of dread, It's funny to think military device, right?
Mm.
You'd have a team of crossbowmen with a pavis and a guy, doing all the windlass spanning and a guy doing the shooting, and just it's such where I can imagine a Cranaquin or a goat's foot lever or something. That seems like a more reasonable device. It's like the windlass is just such a fiddly thing.
It is for sure. And I mean, speaking of Todd's workshop and his YouTube channel, he's got, and you mentioned earlier that he's got a video that takes you through all of the various spanning mechanisms, and it's really really great because because he takes you through them one at a time, you can immediately see the advantages of some over the others. And I mean, Cranaquins are amazing because just because of the gear ratios involved, they can span an enormous weight, like over 1,000 pounds of draw weight. But they're also fiddly because once you've cranked it all the way back and taken the Cranaquin off, well, you have to crank the Cranaquin all the way back again before you're able to put on and span the next crossbow. So what we do find is that you did have, like for example, with when aristocrats were going hunting with their Cranaquin crossbows, they'd have their servant spanning one of the
Yeah,
crossbows while they're shooting, so that just to sort of save time in that way. So, but that, I mean, to me, that speaks to the trade-off, right? That you get. So if you're using a hand bow, yeah, you've had to train for 10 years to be able to shoot it effectively, but you can shoot, many
you're a
times.
one-man team.
Exactly, and many times while a crossbow can shoot once.
It's really funny to me because I'm a big Warhammer guy. I'm not sure if you
Mhm.
are, but I grew up playing Warhammer Fantasy, and in Warhammer Fantasy, the three big ranged weapons are the longbow, the crossbow, and the handgun. And
Mhm.
you can speak to how I think maybe a little bit silly this is, but in the way the game differentiates these three weapons, which has always seemed funny to me, is that the longbow is it has a 30-inch range on the tabletop, right? So it can fire. A guy with a longbow can shoot 30 inches.
Mhm.
It has basically the strength of the user, so that makes sense. But then you get to crossbows and handguns, and the crossbows outrange the handguns by about 6 inches. The crossbow's range is 30, and a handgun's range is 24. And the handgun
Mhm.
is better against armor. And yeah, that always seemed a little bit silly to me because basically the crossbows handguns are placed on the same level playing field, and this is it's kind of ridiculous because the guns are not like handguns; they're like muskets.
Oh, right, right.
uh, which they have like flip mechanisms and things like that. I'm like, wow, that easily eclipsed where the crossbow was.
Yeah, yeah,
And the crossbows are
yeah.
hand spun. I have crossbow guys, and they don't have any spanning devices. I have no idea how they are pulling back a crossbow that outshoots a gun by hand.
Well, and
um,
especially one that can shoot the same range as a hand bow. Um, yeah, yeah,
uh,
it's interesting, and I think, and actually, I think sort of the way that these kind of things are interpreted in role playing games. Actually, a very good friend of mine is currently designing his own role playing game, and he called me to ask, well, how should I handle crossbows? And so, in the course of that discussion, um, it really, in order to make the rules accurate, to the way crossbows actually function, whether you're talking about a lightweight crossbow or a heavyweight crossbow versus handbows, we realized, well, in the context of this game where essentially you've got like a party of people going off adventuring, things like that, a crossbow would be completely useless in that kind of melee combat. Because, I mean, one imagines, let's say you're going into a dungeon, and so you're expecting trouble, so you span and load your crossbow. So certainly you've got an advantage at the very beginning of a fight. You take your shot. After that, no, you're done, right? And
Yeah,
you
you
may as well get out your knife or your sword or whatever, right? So it was very interesting though, and I think thinking it through in those sort of gamified terms is actually quite useful, to really understanding the dynamic, between these various weapons and sort of the differential. I mean, with crossbows, one thing I didn't mention, which I think is important to the discussion, and I don't really have, I've not done enough research into it, and I would like to, which is that, talking about like the energy that a crossbow is putting out versus a hand bow, because it's got such a smaller power stroke, it needs to have a much more powerful bow, a much more powerful prod, right? But what that also means is that it can shoot a much heavier projectile, and that a handbow cannot. And so when you're shooting a heavier projectile at that same velocity, you're imparting more energy. So that's a very important, differential, let's say, between crossbows and handbows.
It is, it's like one of those things. If your friend is ever interested in getting some publicity for his game, you can send me an email.
Sure.
A lot of people do want me to talk about them, but it is interesting to sort of think about crossbows in that kind of way. And sometimes when you're making a game, you just have to decide. I just have to split the difference, right?
Mm.
I want to have crossbows in the game, and they have to be different from the guns or different from the bows, and therefore, that's I don't think a game can ever really capture how fiddly they can be.
Right,
Which
right.
is to say that any kind of battle, and I speak from experience of doing HEMA for many, many years. Real sword
Mhm.
fights are not like sword fights in the movies or in the video games. They're much more fiddly than they seem.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and I can imagine that the stress of loading a crossbow, it could just cause you all kinds of jams and all kinds of other issues. But the
Yeah, yeah.
last thing I want to talk about, because I think we're kind of heading towards the time, is to just talk very briefly about slur bows and sort of stone bows, because that's the thing that I feel like most
Mm.
people have no idea about.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, and certainly for me, when I was getting into this and doing my research, it was a surprising, discovery for me. And I mean, they're so common, and so many of the surviving crossbows, that you come across in museums are in fact stone bows and bullet crossbows. And Italy has a very, very strong tradition, and these now in virtually all these cases, we're talking about the early modern period. So certainly from the 16th century and forward. And Italy has a very, very strong tradition of stone crossbows, as does Germany, as does England. England, there's actually a book written by Arthur Credland, which is all about the evolution of the English bullet crossbow. And at this point in time, they're starting to look a lot more like rifles. There's another segue to a different conversation about the back and forth, the transfer of design between the early firearms and crossbows, and there was certainly a back and forth. But anyway,
Oh, that'd be
yeah,
fascinating.
and
Maybe for another time.
yeah, it's really, really interesting, and there's certainly a lot more work to be done there. But yeah, slur bows in particular, and so a slur bow, as I understand it, the word slur bow is a modern, kind of word, to describe, a very specific type of crossbow that originated in Germany, which the German word, for it that I know is called Kulissenschnepper. And I don't know the literal translation, but
That is a very
it's
German word.
yes, yes, it's a mouthful. And it's a type of crossbow that evolved directly from the Schnepper type, which is all a Schnepper really it's a crossbow that has a specific type of lock mechanism. So instead of using the rolling nut, lock mechanism that was the state of the art for centuries, now it's a metal catch that holds the string in a groove, in the top of the crossbow. It's actually a bit more efficient, than a rolling nut crossbow. So the Kulissen Schnepper took a Schnepper crossbow and essentially put a wooden top over the top of the bolt groove, and what that does is it enables you to load in a round lead ball and shoot that instead of a bolt. And so these were typically used for shooting small game and birds and things like that.
Yeah, instead of having an open tiller, I believe that's what it's called, you have actually now you've kind of almost made a barrel. Um,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
which is funny because in doing some of the research for those types of weapons, I've seen crossbows that have barrels.
That's
Um,
right.
they have and maybe that's a subject for a second follow-up talk, but they have actual barrels, and I thought to myself, wow, that's really cool.
Yeah.
that's such a
Yeah.
that's such a crazy piece of technology, right? I love
Yeah.
it when two things that seem different are get they get mashed together, like a crossbow that has a barrel. I don't even know
Hmm.
if it's a crossbow anymore, really. At that point, it's like a third thing. Um, but yeah, I mean, these you have one that I think is really really well made, but yours can fire both bolts and pellets, basically.
That's right. That's right. And so that really is that German Kulissenschnepper, where it was designed to do both things. So the that top rail, you could take that off, and then you could just shoot crossbow bolts as normal. But if you put that top rail on, then all of a sudden you can shoot round shots. So the one of my customers is a guy in Texas, and he actually collects antique firearms. He's got a vast collection of antique firearms, and he knows an enormous amount about antique firearms. And he decided he wanted to get into crossbows, and so he commissioned me to make the Kulissenschnepper. And so he uses that actually for hunting. So he hunts small game with it, and he's been able to actually take down game both with bolts and with lead shot, because he's able to cast his own 50 caliber
Oh,
lead shot from a
wow.
traditional lead mold. Yeah, so he uses that, and it evidently works really well. Yeah.
Is there any evidence these police schnappers were used in warfare or against people, or is it just animals?
No, no, just hunting. Yeah, yeah. So once you get beyond, again, once you get beyond the 15th century, they just weren't used in warfare anymore. I mean, I'm sure there was murderous folks who use them from time to time against people in private, you know, conflicts. But yeah, in terms of military applications, it's just not seen anymore beyond the 15th century.
Yeah, it's interesting because and this is the final thing that I'll say is that there is kind of like in the 18th century, well, in the 17th century, and also later on in the 18th century, there is kind of murmurings. Every you'll see somebody talk about how we should bring back the longbow. It shoots much faster than these muskets. Um,
Hmm.
Seemed to be the case that crossbows had that kind of revival because in some sense they never really went away as bows did because people were still hunting with them, target shooting. But on the other hand, I think everybody realized that the bow compared to the gun was not a fair comparison for the crossbow, basically.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, and crossbows. I mean, and bows for that matter just cannot compete with the power of firearms. Even early firearms that gunpowder driven, even though they weren't particularly accurate. I mean, the kind of power that was available there, you just couldn't compete with it.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so I think this has been a very fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for taking the time. And when I do have the crossbow in hand, I will be sure to also make another video about that. Maybe we can do another follow up. Viewers at home, take a look at Duncan's shop. Maybe you want a crossbow. You can send him an email. The link to the shop will be in the description. Unfortunately, you've missed out on the opportunity to buy one of the kits that Duncan makes. He makes, well, you can describe them to the audience.
Sure, yeah. So in addition to custom crossbows that are made to order, I also periodically do runs of crossbow kits, and so these are kits where you get the wooden stock, you get the roller nut and the various metal parts, and essentially what you all you need to do is really carve the stock to however style you like and finish it, and then put the whole thing together. And so those I do in production runs usually once or twice a year. So I've just finished a production run in February. But if there's enough interest, if enough people email me, I'd be happy to do another production run right away. So definitely send email if you're interested in that.
Yeah, and also if you're just interested in learning about crossbows, Duncan is enormously um, experienced and knowledgeable, and also willing to talk to people. So that's
Yes, yeah,
that's like the
that's
two.
true.
I when I sent you an email, I didn't know if you'd even respond to me. That was one of the because sometimes I will send people emails and I will never hear a response, and I think, okay, well,
Yeah,
I wasn't, maybe they just weren't interested or whatever. So yeah, I very much enjoyed this conversation. I feel like we have a lot more to talk about. We could maybe talk more about crossbows in media because you mentioned that you were a big fan of, well, you're more familiar with TV and movies. We didn't talk about crossbows in
mhm,
Game of Thrones. That I think
right.
that is, oh boy, yeah, Game of Thrones. Okay, so thank you everybody for checking out this video. Um, like and subscribe. Comment all of that stuff. Where do you stand on crossbows versus bows or firearms? That's a fun topic. Till next time, take care and goodbye.